Afternoon. I really want to thank you for coming today. If you aren't aware, we are officially launching our new seed library today, and we thought this would be a wonderful way to kick that off. Our seed library is sponsored by the Friends of the Howell Library through a generous donation by the Brighton Optimist Club and Eternity Brewing. With their thoughtful contribution, we've been able to stock our library with over 25 different varieties of seeds. There is no cost to you for the seeds, and anyone is able to select up to 5 different varieties per visit. You're welcome to visit the seed library after this program. That's up on the main level, right by our information desk. And then I'll be available, Amber will be available to answer any questions you may have about the seed library and how that works. With all of that said, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Brent Crane, our new Horticulture Extension in Livingston County. Brent is actually a product of Livingston, born and raised in and a graduate of Howell High School. He brings broad horticulture expertise, having worked professionally in research and production systems in small fruits, fruits, field crops, and urban and landscape trees. Brent enjoys working with home gardeners and making the knowledge produced through innovative research accessible to all. So please welcome me and join Dr. Crane.
Is pulling on me funny, so hopefully it won't do anything too weird. Very happy to be here, and I'm really glad that we're launching a seed library here. As she said, I was raised in Howell, and my dad delivered mail to most of the places in Howell, most of the addresses at one point. So anyone who's lived here for, anybody who was here a couple decades ago probably had him at one point. All right, so today, we always like to remind people, MSU programming is open to everybody, and that's just something that's important to us as an institution, so we make it a point to welcome people of any background whatsoever. All right, so we'll look at several different things today. In terms of a general outline, what do seeds need to grow? Planting seeds indoors, preparing and planting a garden, and then a little bit about seed saving, not very much about seed saving though. All right, so there aren't a lot of kids here, but for those who are here, we do have gifts for you. And these are little 3D planters that I put together. And almost nothing will color those, but the things that will color them are crayons. So I included a little pack of crayons. You have to press kind of hard to get the bottom to connect. And if you separate the bottom from it too many times, then it won't connect anymore. But otherwise, it's pretty fun. And the real question is, as my son discovered, is it really a lightsaber? Because if you shine light through the bottom, Baby Yoda's not my son, by the way, it's the one in the middle. But if you shine the light through the bottom, it's really cool. All right, so tell me, what do seeds need to grow? So how many of you have done some sort of gardening in the past? Okay, almost everyone, right? Good. So we have experts right here. So I can just facilitate. Okay, so what is one thing that seeds need to grow? Light, soil, water. Yeah, see someone saying not soil, right. And which is, right, hydroponics, right? And it's part of a question too, are we talking about to germinate or to continue growing? So we will talk about soil in here because we'll be mostly doing work in soil. Although the funny thing about that too is that when you go and buy potting mix at some place, usually those are soilless mixes. So we call it soil, but there's no soil in it. All right, so let's go through a few of these. So what does the soil provide? What are some reasons that if we have soil, what is that soil providing that's useful? Nutrients. Water, yes. Stability, yes. So these, it's providing a place for these roots to anchor. As the roots are there, they're able to draw in water and nutrients. It's also providing oxygen. So if you have a good soil structure, then there are pockets of oxygen. What happens to the roots without oxygen? They'll rot. They shrivel, they die, they rot, yeah. All right, so what does the water provide? What was that?
They just said avocados.
Yeah.
Not that they provide avocados, those are avocados.
Avocados they don't come from water?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. Okay, so oxygen's a tricky one, right? So there is oxygen dissolved in that water. There's not a lot of oxygen dissolved in that water. So most plant roots don't like to be setting down in that water with so little oxygen. But avocado does just fine. And there's a lot of plants where you can take cuttings and start them in water. So there is enough oxygen in there. And incidentally, what's the other gas that the roots are giving off? Do you know? Carbon dioxide. If they're giving off hydrogen, there's something wrong with that plant. But it would be kind of cool because then you mix it with the oxygen and then you could light it. But anyway, sorry, I have 3 kids at home and sometimes I act younger than them. All right, so there's a little bit about water. So what does the light provide? So here's an experiment that was done, not by my lab, but so these are seeds planted at the same time, some grown under light, some not grown under light. So why is light important? So it converts energy through photosynthesis. Yes. So then why are the ones that don't have light taller? Trying to find light. So if they don't have light, where are they getting all this energy to go from this little tiny seed all the way up here? What's providing that energy? The seed. Thank you. And some plants are lucky and they have the big fat seed like the avocado. Others are not very lucky and you have a little tiny seed like lettuce. But that seed, this plant will desperately try to grow as tall as it can to find light, hoping that it's going to get through the soil, but it's already past the soil. It's just stuck in a closet somewhere. All right. And how about air? So what does air provide? Why does a plant need air? Carbon dioxide. So, and we mentioned also that the roots need oxygen. The rest of the plant needs carbon dioxide. Yes. So here, I'm sure all of you have heard of photosynthesis, probably ad nauseum. But you have your plant, in this case anchored in soil. It draws up water. It brings in carbon dioxide, mostly through the thing called the stomata, so little openings in the leaf surface, mostly the underside of the leaf, sometimes on the top. Brings in carbon dioxide, and then sunlight provides the energy that is needed for a chemical reaction where the carbon dioxide and the water come together to produce carbohydrates, which are then converted into sugars. And then a byproduct of that is that these plants produce oxygen. So that's one of the, we talk about plants being so important for our own oxygen and the rainforest being the lungs of the planet. That's because of the ability of plants to produce this oxygen that we need. All right, so let's talk about planting seeds indoors. So what do we need in order to plant seeds? So you pick up, maybe not the wildflower seeds, but you go to the seed library and you get beans. And you decide that you want to, maybe that's a bad example. So some things we like to plant early indoors because they take a long time to grow. So if you plant a tomato by seed in the garden, you may not get as many tomatoes as if you started them indoors a few weeks earlier. So let's say you want to grow some tomatoes. What do you need in order to do that at home? Container. You need some sort of container. Does it matter what kind of container? I mean, different containers have different benefits, right? So if it's porous, you get more breathability, like a clay pot. But you can use an old, yogurt carton. You can use a 5-gallon bucket from Home Depot, right? So you can really plant anything, but it does need to be well drained, or you need to not give it much water at a time. So you either have to be careful on how much water you put in, or you punch some drainage holes in the bottom and you make sure that it's well drained. Now, what we're not recommending anymore, I know that people used to recommend putting like gravel or something on the bottom in order to help with drainage. That actually doesn't help with drainage. It actually causes problems with creating water pooling down in that area. And there's a number of things that can result from that, and they're not good for the roots of the plant. So now we just recommend that you now I'm jumping ahead because we only talked about containers, but we recommend in terms of the soil or the soilless mix, we recommend that you get a good potting mix that's well drained. For starting seeds, it doesn't need to have fertilizer added to it because the seeds will not need that for germinating. If you get the ones that say, fertilizer added or whatever, they're probably not going to harm the seed, but it doesn't really need it. When the plants are a little older is when they would benefit from that. So what else do we need? So we have containers, and I spilled the beans about soil or a potting mix. Oh, and I should ask you this. What about just going out to your yard or your garden and digging up some good old soil to throw into a container? Does that work or not? Sometimes. Now, it kind of depends on what your soil is. It makes a big difference. Like, are you on sand? Are you on clay? Are you on this nice loam that's like the perfect blend? So if you are trying to do something like that and you don't want to pay all that money for the potting mixes, I would probably suggest that you try to get some good quality compost, which you can buy like some of the landscape places, unless you make your own. Some of the landscape places you can buy it by the 5-gallon bucket, or you have to buy larger quantities. But I've done straight compost in these, and we normally recommend that you really don't want more than like 50% organic matter, which is what the compost is. And it kind of depends on what's in that compost, because sometimes there's like too much nutrients in there and it like burns the roots of certain plants. But you can experiment with it. And you can, if you want to use garden soil, something out of the ground, I'd probably say, mix it half and half with something lighter, like compost or something like that. All right, what else do we need? So we have our pots, we have our soil. What else do plants need to grow? Water. So we need a source of water. So when do you put the water in? Before or after you stick the seeds in? Before. I'm hearing before. Why is that? So if you're using a garden soil, it probably has some moisture in it, and you probably don't need to add anything. If you happen to get something that's like peat moss based, which we're trying to steer people away from peat moss as much as possible now, just because the mining operation where peat moss is taken out of the ground releases a ridiculous amount of carbon into the air. It also is just generally not good for the environment as they strip it away. So some other things like the coconut fiber, are better. But sometimes you just get, especially now, you just get what's available, right? But with something like a lot of these, like the sphagnum moss, they're very difficult to hydrate. So when you first take it, unless there's wetting agents that have been added to that soil mix, when you pour water in, it's going to stay dry and powdery in your hand. So you take like a bucket, put some water in, kind of work it in, give it time to soak in, add some more, kind of make a slurry. And eventually you get something that's pretty good. And what you're looking for is, so that when you take it and you squeeze it in your hand, you don't want any water to squeeze out, but you want it to hold together and feel moist. And then it's ready to put your seeds in. All right. So let's talk about planting depth. How deep do you put your seeds in that pot? Depends on the seed. Is there a rule of thumb? If, like, let's say you get, so let's say that you get a seed and it doesn't, like a lot of them.
He wasn't showing that.
I didn't make that movie. It's just entertainment.
Your movie was confusing us.
Yeah, sorry about that. I just did it because it was like pretty, But, well, one of the things that I'll tell you, so we have rules of thumb on all these things, but the important thing is go out and have fun with it. The reality is, you remember we call it etiolated seeds. So when they're grown in the dark, they get really tall. That's etiolated, because we can't just say they get really tall because we're scientific-y, right? So that means if you take that seed and you planted it 5 inches down, it would have made it to the top. Would it have expended a lot of energy getting there? Absolutely, but would have made it there. Not all seeds will make it there. So the general rule of thumb is to plant it 2 to 3 times the depth of the seed, but it kind of depends. Some lettuces will not germinate unless they have light. in which case with some of these fine seeds, we'll kind of sprinkle them on the surface, press them in a little bit, and maybe sprinkle some sand over the top to kind of hold them in place and hold in some moisture. But yeah, I mean, you can plant things at different depths, and they say if you get a seed packet and it says how deep to put it, try to put it in that far. One thing I found with corn, I used to do tons and tons of corn outside with this company I worked for. And one thing we found is if you didn't get it down at least 2 inches, birds were coming and pulling them out as soon as they germinated. So the ones that were planted with this little thing that you step on to put it down, those were only getting down like 1.5 inches. And the ones that I was planting with a Sharpie, where you stick it down in the soil and drop it in, none of those got pulled up. So maybe you should use Sharpies. Anyway, but I'm not supposed to do product promotion, so any pen will work. Anyway, sorry. Okay. So does everyone have a general idea on planting the seed? So it's not difficult. You get your soil, have nice amount of moisture in it, put it in the pot, press your seeds into it. If you want, you can cover the surface with something to keep it from drying out. There's mulches that you could put on there if you wanted to, or a plastic dome some people will use until they've germinated. But everyone has a general idea on how you do that? Okay. Now, at some point, you want to pot up these seeds, or you want to transplant them outside. Let's say it's too cold for your tomato plants outside. How would you know that it might be time to put them in a slightly larger pot? Yeah, so you pick up your pot, and you see these roots coming out. Sometimes you'll even see the plant being pushed up a little bit because there's so many roots in there, it shoves the whole soil ball up. What else could give you a clue that maybe it's time? Stops growing. You're like, wow, this thing's growing so fast. It's growing really fast. How come you're not growing anymore? Yeah. Anything else? How about watering? What if you were only having to water it every 4 days, and now you have to water it twice a day? Yeah, so it's a good indication that maybe it's time for a bigger pot. So we don't typically want to go to a huge pot all of a sudden, because then this plant has all this soil that holds in all this water, and it can get too wet, and that causes problems. But you want to go to something that's like a size or two larger than what it was in. So if it was in something really small, put it in something a little bigger. If you had a bunch of them growing together, because you can start a ton of seeds in one small space like this. And then I would normally transplant them before this, but then you just kind of gently separate them out, separate the roots out carefully, and can plant them up, especially if you don't know what your germination rate's going to be. Let's say you're using 5-year-old tomato seed. You'll probably have pretty good germination depending on how you've been storing it, but you may not, right? So you might want to do a bunch of them in a small space and kind of see what grows. But for transplanting these, it's not very difficult. You just separate them if they're in a thing where you can lift out the entire soil and it all comes together in one clump. Then you don't have to do a whole lot with it unless you've got a lot of roots that are circling. So what happens if you plant the plant and it has all these circling roots and you just keep potting it up like that or planting it in the ground with the roots circling? Root bound, choke itself. With some of these plants, like 1 year kind of annual plants, like our garden plants, it's not as big of a deal. When you get to trees, for example, you can have these trees that might grow fine for like 20 years, and then the thing just dies. You look at it and you're like, what's going on? Or maybe it's a pine tree and it lasts like 8 years and the top dies back. And they've actually done these really cool studies where they injected them with these tracer dyes, these radioactive dyes and some other dyes. And what you could see is that these roots began to grow together. We call it root grafting. So they actually grew together. And instead of the water coming up and going up through the plant, it comes up and gets trapped in this root system, going back and forth and around in this really complicated pattern. And then only some gets up, and it just starves the plant of water. So vegetable garden, good idea anytime. Anytime you've got circling roots, spread them out, tease them out. If it's like a larger plant and you have lots of these roots, you can just take pruners or a knife or something, just cut straight through them, all around the outside of it. Just cut those things up. It won't hurt it at all. It'll grow fine roots in those areas, and then kind of tease them apart and plant them. Okay, any questions on potting up? Yeah. Are you feeling guilty? Okay, so if you planted things and you didn't, you left the roots circling. It depends on how long ago they were planted. But yes, certainly if it's been recent, if it's been within the last year, say, I would have no qualms with pulling it up and reworking it. There may be some other ways of getting around it, like if it's been there longer, depending on how long it's been there. And okay, so we sometimes, for various reasons, do something called root pruning. And can be some benefits to root pruning. So for example, let's say that you're growing this tree and you want to, you want to give it to somebody, or you want to transplant it to a different area. And depending on the size of the tree, you don't necessarily want to bring this huge root ball, and you're not sure how much root or whatever. So what you can do is go out to the drip line of the tree, so the outer edge of the tree canopy, and all the way around it at the drip line, you can cut straight down with the tool of your choice. People can use, depending on your soil, you might get away with a Sawzall, you might get away with, whatever. But cutting around that, it cuts through all those roots that are there, and then new fine roots start to grow. So you cut it through, and then you give it, a few months or something to kind of recover, and then you dig it up at that same space, like around that drip line, you dig it up and move it. So one thing you can do, again, depending on how long it's been and what it is and all that, you might be able to, like if it's difficult to dig out, to just do some cuts kind of through the root system, a couple places around the tree to kind of cut straight down and out from it and kind of open it up. But certainly if you can dig down in there and look at it, like let's say you can dig around the top and you see all where the roots are circling, maybe you can get in there and cut that with something without having to take the whole thing out. My dad used to say, work smarter, not harder. So kind of think it through. But yeah, you want some way of kind of fixing that problem. Yeah. Yeah.
So if your little plants have some recipe you're using for your soil, when you're putting it into the little bit bigger ones, do they have a different recipe for the soil?
Yeah, so the question is about what soil recipe to use. So there are, you can buy seed starter mixes and transplant mixes and all that kind of thing. It kind of depends on your plants. They will grow in a lot of different things. So if you get a seed starter mix and you have extra, you can transplant into that. It'll be fine. But the thing that you'd want to check for is if it doesn't, a lot of the seed starter mixes don't have fertilizer in them. So if there's no fertilizer added, these soilless mixes, they're not generally capable of holding nutrients very well. They'll hold it if you add it to it, but they don't come with nutrients that's available to the plant. So as a result, they add fertilizers to these mixes. So with the seed starter mix, you don't need it because there's enough nutrients inside that seed for it to germinate and grow a little bit. But that'd be the thing to watch for, that you get something that has the fertilizer in it, or that you add a little bit if it needs it. I don't use a lot of fertilizers, and most of my plants do okay. They don't grow as fast. They don't grow as well. With fertilizer, less is sometimes better than more, and never use more than the recommended amount. All right, avoiding problems. So yeah, did you have a plant that did that?
A plant? No, I have dozens.
Oh, then you've come to the right place. All right, who wants to take a guess as to what happened to this plant? No water, overwater, 2 good guesses. What else could have happened? Bacteria, sunlight, outgrew its pot. All right, so this particular one has a fungal disease called damping off. Who's heard of damping off? All right, what causes damping off? It is a fungus, and it shows up when? Cool and wet, particularly the wet. So what it is, so we have a lot of fungi that are just everywhere. We call that ubiquitous because we like fancy words. All right, So these fungi exist in your soils, in your mixes. You're going to find them all over the place. So if it's kept too wet, so when you're doing your seeds, if the soil is kept too wet, particularly if you can pick it up and you squeeze it and some water will drip out, there's a good chance that you're going to have something die to this. And the telltale sign, you can't see it in this picture, but if we could go down just a little bit further there, the stem will get super thin. Gets really thin, and that's where this fungus is working. But this is a great example that I like because it could have been caused by so many different things. And I get people sending me photos, and it'll be like, what happened to my plant? And I'm like, okay, let me give you a list of 16 things. So temperature is a big thing. So we talked about the water. So you want your water, well, maybe we should talk a little more about water, actually, but since I mentioned temperature. So if your plant is used to being indoors and you set it outside overnight or something, or you put it on a shelf next to an outside door and people go in and out and it's 40 degrees outside and 70 degrees inside, your plant can look like that, especially if it's something like a tomato or a tropical kind of plant, just from the temperature change, the cold hitting it when it wasn't used to it. Heat hitting it also, it's setting in a place where suddenly the sun comes straight in and hits it. I think somebody said sun. Yeah, the sunlight directly on it when it's not used to it will make your plant look like that. Having the soil too dry will make your plant look like that. Having your soil too wet will make your plant look like that. So there's a lot of things that can cause it. So in terms of temperature, just try to keep it in an area where there aren't cold drafts, where there's not direct sunlight if it's not used to it, where there's just not extreme changes. And if you need to move it to a different location, we can do something called acclimatizing or acclimating, where you put it there, you put it in those conditions for a little while, and then put it back where it was, and then you let it in the new conditions for a little while longer, so a few hours at a time, and you just kind of build up until it's ready to be moved. All right, and so watching the temperature swings and then also watching the moisture is gonna take care of a lot of your problems. So again, with the moisture, so it's tricky. With seeds, you never want the soil to dry out, because if the soil dries out, your seed will die. So if it's like a young seedling, newly germinated. Once they get a little bit bigger, the larger the plant, the more you can let it dry down before you water it. And once your plants get a little bit of size to them, you want at least the top of the soil to dry out. And ideally it to dry out a little further down in there, and then you want to water it deeply so it gives it lots of water. So water more deep, less often is kind of the rule as they get larger. Yeah?
Well water versus softened water from your faucet.
Go with the well water. Well water versus softened water. What happens to the water when we soften it? Yeah, so what we're doing is we're substituting one salt for another. So typically with hard water, there's calcium, magnesium, sometimes some other things, but mainly calcium and magnesium carbonates that are salts that exist in that water, and it makes your water hard. And there's also iron and things, but so in the softening process, we're removing things like the calcium and the magnesium, and we're replacing those with sodium, and that is toxic for plants. So it's definitely better to use well water. You don't need to use distilled water or something like that. Calcium and magnesium are fine for the plant. Can you get too much magnesium? Yeah, but you're probably not likely to from irrigation. Yeah.
So, I remember when I was a kid, they used to say, get water from the tap, but then leave it set for a day or two. Is that an old wives' tale, or is there any validity to that?
So, yeah, so the question is, when I was a kid, they used to say you get your water, let it set for a day or two. So part of the thinking behind that is that chloride was added to water. You're talking about well water or city water? City water. So chlorine was added. And so you want to give it a chance for that to evaporate out. City systems typically, I don't know about this area, but typically they're now adding chloramine instead of chlorine, and that will actually not evaporate out. So really, you are not going to see a benefit to waiting on it unless they happen to. And even then, I don't think there'd be enough chloride in there to actually affect the plants. But don't quote me on that because I'm not positive about that. But there is that switch to chloramine, so it will make no difference. All right. Let's talk about preparing your outdoor garden. So if this looks like your garden space, then you might be in trouble. I don't know if you want this or not, but it's just a little pot that's made with a 3D printer, and you can color on it. Give you something to do, because I know I'm kind of boring, so I'm willing to admit it, and my kids tell me that all the time. All right, so do you think it's a good idea to plow right now? Now, I can't speak for this area and how they do things, but if this were here, would you want to be plowing right now? Why not? Because we don't grow rice here. No, that's out in California, where we irrigate rice in California because there's a water shortage. All right, sorry, you were saying something, I think? Yeah, I'm sorry, what? Soil compaction, yes. Yes. So soil compaction is a huge problem. And once your soil compacts down, you lose the structure. And then you lose the ability to hold and make water and air and nutrients available to that plant. So it's very important to not be out there working your soil when it's wet. The other thing, well, I guess we'll get into it. I think I might actually have a slide. Yeah. So let's talk about your site selection. So that was not an ideal site because there's a lot of water there, and it looks like there's often a lot of water there. But, as you say, for rice, another story, right? So you guys remember what plants need to grow? Air, light, nutrients, water. I swear someone said butter, but I bet it was water. All right. So when you're looking for a site, you ideally want to find a space that's going to give 10 hours of light per day. If you can't find that, then try for 8 hours. If you can't find that, find the most you can. So this kind of depends on if you're doing containers that you move around because you don't have a garden space, or if you're going to actually make a garden space in your yard somewhere, or maybe you already have one. So you want to try for as much light as you can get. Now, this 8 hours, kind of watch what happens as the sun travels through the sky. Kind of watch what happens during the day if you can, and get an idea of how much light is actually in an area. But the other thing is, that day length changes, right? Right? So the end of June, you might have 18 hours of sunlight. Right now, we don't have 18 hours of sunlight. So it's a little tricky with that 8 hours, but think about like during the growing season in general, can we get that 8 hours of light? Water nearby is, yes?
Question, if we're starting indoors, do you still need 18 hours?
It kind of depends on what you're growing, but you certainly don't need, if you're starting it under lights, I don't know, are you doing lights or just?
Yeah, just tomatoes under lights.
Yeah, so if you're doing things under lights, so those lights that you're using are not going to produce as much energy as the sun does. So we compensate for that by extending the time period a bit. In general, if you're doing 12 hours, that's probably ample. If you do more, you will get more growth. If you do less, you get a little less growth, and it does vary some based on the type of plants. Tomatoes are tropical plants, so one of the things that will affect them as much or more than the light is going to be the temperature. So the warmer you can make it up to a reasonable temperature, the faster it will grow, which is why I didn't mention it, but when you're starting seeds, there are seed heating mats that you can put underneath, or you can put the seeds up on top of the refrigerator where the warm air comes, or wherever you get some warm spots in your house, you can put the seed trays there, because the warmer it is, the quicker these seeds will germinate up until a point. And it kind of depends, like cool season things like lettuces like it a little bit cooler, whereas something like tomato really likes it warmer, 85, and it'd be really happy. But yeah, good question.
One more question about site selection, too, I'm sorry.
No.
I noticed a lot of my neighbors have like raised beds. Is there a benefit to a raised bed versus a...
Yeah. So the question is there a benefit to using raised beds versus the ground? There are a lot of benefits to it, kind of depending on what your condition is like. So a few things. Soil temperature is the most important determiner of when you can put things in the ground in the spring. Raised beds will heat up earlier in the spring in general. The other thing is if you've got heavy clay soil and things will not grow very well in there, it's difficult to amend it. Now you can amend clay. Who knows what to add to clay to make a lighter soil that drains better? Well, oh, I'm so happy someone said sand. Congratulations, you just made concrete. So, sand does work if you get your mix just right. If you don't get it right, then you will make concrete. So compost, thank you, yes. So we recommend that people add organic matter. In particular, compost is a wonderful thing, or whatever you got that's organic matter. Grass clippings. If you ever made leaf mold, does anybody know what leaf mold is? Yeah, so some of you are familiar with leaf mold. So you take a big pile of leaves and you leave it there and you let it compost. And it breaks down into this nice, we like to call it soil, but there's no soil there, a nice soilless mix. Makes a wonderful compost. So yeah, adding organic matter in. And one of the best ways to do that, think about building your soil over time. So every year, if the organic matter in your soil, based on a soil test, which MSU offers soil tests, if it's less than 5%, then add organic matter every year, and you will build that soil over time. So put in, you don't want to go crazy, so compost, depending on where it's from, can be really high in nutrients, and sometimes if it's too high in nutrients, that's not good for the plants either. So if you don't really know where it's from, then, I would say, add like an inch or two. I wouldn't be putting on mixing in like 5 inches. If you're trying to prepare the site for the first time, getting a soil test is a really good idea, because then you know maybe what you would need to add. And if you're preparing it for the first time and it's clay and you want to add in a ton of compost, you could do that and till it in. One of the things I was saying about tilling is we're starting to recommend that people do less tilling versus more, because every time you till it, you break up the soil structure, which is something that's really important for soil health. And it also releases a lot of carbon into the air. And if you, like I was saying, if you do it too much, like people like to go out and they like to till it in the early spring, like to till it every time the weeds come up, they like to, till in fertilizer, they like to, till in all this stuff. Every time you hit that, you run the risk of creating a compacted layer lower down underneath where you're tilling, and also breaking down that soil structure where you're tilling. So it's fine to do it once in a while, but it's one of those things where less is more. Okay, so back to the site selection. So you want someplace where water is nearby. And that's because most of these garden plants need about an inch of water per week. So that's if you picture an inch of rain spread over the entire surface of the ground where your garden is, that's how much they need every week. And it's good to have that broken down, like I like to say a half inch every 4 days. It kind of depends. If you're on sand, then you need more than that. And you'll kind of, you look at your plants, if they're wilting and they're not wilting because they've been kept too wet, which is a big problem. But if they're wilting, then yeah, it's a good idea to water them. And if it's really hot out, they might need some extra water. So having water nearby is really helpful. And then having fertile, well-drained soil. So if you've got clay, or if you've got, even if you have decent soil and then there's like a hard pan layer of like clay or something, 1 foot down, it gets really challenging. And this goes back to the question about raised beds. I really was answering that question. I just forgot about it. So when you got trouble soils like that, building a raised bed at least 8 inches deep, 12 inches deep is better. You really don't need to go deeper than that. That gets you out of that trouble area. So you'll still trap water under there, but it lets you put in a good soil mix that things can grow in well. And most of these things that you're growing in your garden are not putting roots really down more than like 8 to 12 inches anyway. Really, most things happen in the top 8 inches of soil. So raised beds are good, and we'll get into that a little bit more here in a minute. So I mentioned that we have these soil tests. So MSU offers 2 different soil tests. One was the original commercial soil test. That's $13 per test, and people that if you have like whatever, 10 acres of corn or something, you want to do a few tests, then you might want to use that. The home one is $25 plus shipping if you order it from the site. You can also pick it up sometimes at the local county office, extension office, like we have it, here in town at the county office. And it costs quite a bit more, but you're getting quite a bit more information out of it. So, like, you're getting soil texture. Now that means it gives you an idea of, are you on sand? Are you on clay? Are you on a sandy loam? So it gives you an idea of what kind of soil you're on, which from that you can get an idea of how well drained it is and how much nutrients it can hold. It also gives you pH. So most garden plants like a pH they define between, well, slightly acidic, so let's say between 6.2 and 6.8. So if you're familiar with pH, 7 is neutral, so deionized water, so water where you strip all the everything except just pure water out of it, like distilled water be similar, pH of 7. So slightly acidic. If you're a little bit alkaline, most things will probably grow just fine, so I wouldn't worry about it. But if you do the soil test, it'll tell you what the pH is, and it will give you any recommendations for adjusting the pH. Now realize if you're going to lower the pH and make it more acidic, this is not a quick process unless you actually inject acid into the soil, which we do in commercial situations. But for home gardeners, we typically recommend that you add elemental sulfur, which you can get at a garden center. But the trick with elemental sulfur is it takes 6 months to a year to really see an effect. And then you continue to see it slowly lowering the pH over a number of years. There are some other tricks that can make it go faster, there's some other things that you can use, but it's good to get that soil test and plan ahead. And even if you look at it, and you realize it's not going to do much good this year, but you're going to use that garden space again next year, you could go ahead and add in that elemental sulfur this year, go ahead and plant, everything will grow, just fine, and then next year you'll have a lower pH. All right, it also talks about nutrient context, organic matter. So again, if you're less than 5%, if less than 5% of your soil volume is organic matter, then it's good to add things like compost. And you want to try to incorporate that into the first few inches if you can, even just raking it in. If you can't do that, just leaving it on the soil surface is also helpful. Just doesn't work quite as fast. And finally, it'll give you, if you do buy this one, it gives you recommendations. And the nice thing about this one too, so it will send you a link and you go on the website, and it doesn't work well if you're not online, but if you go on the website and you're going to tell them when you submit the sample what you want it for. So say you want a vegetable garden. So the website will come up with your results, and it will give the recommendations for fertilizer and pH for your vegetable garden. And then you say, you know what? I'm only going to do vegetable garden on half of it, and I want the other half to be lawn. Well, on this web form, you can just change the drop-down menu from vegetables to lawn and repopulate it, and it will give you the recommendations, the new fertilizer and pH adjustment recommendations for lawn. So that's something that's really handy. You won't get that with the cheaper commercial test. All right, so back to site preparation. So, yeah.
I have a question on the test.
Mm-hmm.
How do you send in the sample?
So if you buy that home test, it comes in this little Tyvek bag, and it has all the instructions. So what you do is you get, I use a soil core that sticks in the ground, but you probably use a spade or a shovel or whatever, and you get soil from several different places in the area that you're sampling. And then you will mix those things together, let it dry, and put in the measured amount that it calls for. And then you just put it in the mailbox, and it has postage paid that goes right to MSU. Yeah, and that's why we developed this. There's no more, bring your quart Ziploc bag down to MSU lab or to the poor secretary at the extension office and dump it on her desk. People, I don't know if you ever saw that back in the day, but you'd see soil drying all over these, desks. But anyway, so again, use no-till or minimal tilling, especially, so if you're using a raised bed, another benefit of a raised bed, build the thing no more than 4 feet wide, and then the average person can work from either side and reach the middle of that raised bed, and then never walk on it. Now, your kids will probably walk on it if they're like mine, but don't walk on it because that compacts it down. Yeah.
So the tilling or no tilling, does that include digging with your fork thing, your fork tool? Or is that more big?
It's more, we're talking about like actually tilling with a tiller, yeah, kind of a thing. So, digging with your tool, like if you're trying to get weeds out or loosen the soil where you're planting, that kind of thing's fine. You have to dig out your planting hole, right? But it's very different when you've got this like multi-tine tiller, going through something as opposed to you just there with your little tool. So yeah.
I just kind of jumping ahead where you talk about heavier sandy soils. What if like you have a planter box like we have on our porch and then like you get this torrential downpour and like, you know, we had last summer where like rain for a day and a half and then everything was just saturated.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you avoid that? You not have drainage.
Yeah. So if you have like a planter box and it gets this deluge on it and it just floods it, that is problematic. I mean, the only way to avoid that would be to shelter it with something. Go out and lay on top of it as the rain comes. An umbrella, yeah. Anyway, build a small house over it. So once it's saturated, if you have a good, well-draining soil or soilless mix, then it will hopefully drain down pretty well. Make sure that you have enough drainage holes in the bottom. Sometimes with sensitive plants, I've actually had to dig them out and pot them in something drier. But it really depends on what you have and how sensitive it is. Usually in that kind of situation, I just kind of let nature take its course and see what happens. But if it's something that you definitely want to save, then just get it out of that. It depends on the plant. Okay, so there are some plants, I mean, typically, most plants would be fine for a few days. Once you get beyond that, then you're going to start losing some plants. Some can only tolerate a few hours, others can go for a few weeks. So it really depends on the plant. If it's wet like that and you start seeing wilting symptoms, you need to get it out immediately. And then if you see roots that are rotted at that point, you need to prune those off just down to healthy roots that should be white or like a light brown. They should look healthy. Get rid of all the other stuff.
Okay, so the deluge rains come,
Mm-hmm.
you have these planter boxes and these baskets and everything else, and they get completely saturated. But they drain. So are they gonna be all right on their own after a few days, or you still have to worry about it to the same degree?
Well, what did you put in them? Did you put your garden soil in it, which we recommended against? Because if so, they're not going to drain very well, probably. But yeah, if you have a good mix, hopefully it will drain. Like most of the time, I wouldn't do anything with them. But there just are some times where it's not draining very well, and you can tell it's staying wet, and that's when you'd want to do something more. But yeah, I'm definitely not saying that every time it rains you need to go out and dig up all your plants and repot them. Yeah, don't do that. Let's see. Okay, so again, organic matter is the best thing for heavier standing soils. We talked about that, and only adjust the pH if you know that it needs it based on a soil test. Okay, so don't just assume, this is true for your lawn too, just because the other guy's putting lime on his lawn doesn't mean that yours needs it, okay? So without knowing the pH and getting recommendations from the lab, you really shouldn't be doing things that mess with your pH. All right, so going back to soil structure, so this is one of the coolest things about soil. So all these little things, there's clay, there's sand, there's silt are the three main components. All of these things are bound together by glue that is made from organic matter by microbes in the soil. So you need the organic matter and you need the microbes. The microbes will do great in the soils that we've been describing. So if your soil is well drained and it's not kept saturated, then these microbes will grow just fine and they'll create this glue for you, and they will bind sand and silt and clay into these aggregates, where when you work that soil, you feel those clumps that kind of hold together. You don't want it to just collapse in your hand, which is what you can get with stuff that's been overworked, like if it's been tilled too much and it just collapses and there's no structure to it. So it's important because this provides pore space, which it will fill up with water. So say you get a huge deluge, it'll fill up completely with water. That's called saturated. But then it will drain, and when you have these larger sand grains and stuff in this good soil, it will drain down, but it will hold, in all these different pore spaces, it will hold water and nutrients and make those available to the plants to take up, and it will also hold the oxygen that's needed. So we really want to do what we can to protect that structure. And to build that, again, like I mentioned, adding organic matter, if you're below 5% organic matter, is really helpful. So compost, if you use manure, don't put raw manure on there. Make sure it's well composted manure. And some types of animal manure are not good choices for gardens. So just be careful what you put on there. And like also with manure, there's a lot of nutrients in there, and there's a lot of things that could burn stuff. So just again, less is more with some of these things. If you don't know a whole lot about it, don't put a lot of it in your garden space.
Real quick, it says grass on there. Can you use grass clippings?
Yeah, you can use grass clippings.
Do they gotta die first, or can you use?
No, you can throw them in there. They're fine. So I know that sometimes you'll hear people talk about how if you put like green things like grass clippings on there, that it will bind up the nitrogen and make nitrogen inaccessible to the plants. And what we found in the studies is that there is a little bit of an effect, but it's only at a very surface level, and it's really insignificant in almost all cases. So it's fine to go ahead and throw it on there, and you don't need to worry about composting it first. All right, so when you prepare your garden, it's good to get an idea of what you're going to do with your space. So when you look at these seed packets, you will see, this one takes 3 months to mature, and this one takes, 30 days, and, this one's only 2 weeks. And so there's all kinds of things. And this one, this one's cool season, this is warm season, so you have to plant different times. So it can be kind of confusing. So think about the space that you have. Think about what you want to plant where. Think about when you want to plant different things. Draw yourself a little map. It's a really easy way to look at it. It says, I want to transplant my tomatoes, around a certain time, certainly after the last frost date, right? But and think about like intercropping. So mixing things together we call it. We talk about biodiversity. This is like really helpful. If you have all your tomatoes together and they get hit with Septoria leaf spot, it's going to spread right down the line, and you'll probably lose all of them, okay? But if you've got them kind of spread out and you've got some other things planted along the way, then you break that up, because this stuff is spread. So these are like, typically like fungal and sometimes bacterial diseases. And especially these fungal diseases, they get spread when you've got humidity or you've got wet conditions. Then these spores generate, and they get slopped onto stuff, and they stick because of the wet leaves. So they stick to the leaves, and then they infect them. So if you can kind of spread it out, then the spores may not make it over there, and you certainly will certainly give just a little, just the simple thing of spreading it out, like spreading your tomatoes out a little bit, can give you some added protection. And depending on how your garden is laid out, you may or may not be able to do that. But if you can, it's worth doing. Also, intercropping, if you don't have a lot of space, especially, classically people do like these rows. That's what I was raised, we did rows. But you can take things like lettuce and you plant them, but you plant them at the same time as you do things like onions and beets and radishes. And these onions, beets, and radishes mostly grow underground, and they grow deeper. And lettuce is very shallow-rooted. So the shallow-rooted lettuce will grow on top and give you lettuce for several weeks, while these other, like beets and so forth, are developing. In fact, you can, after you harvest your lettuce on top, you probably have enough time to do a second planting of lettuce while these root vegetables are still growing. So it's just a neat way to save space. And there's some other benefits with that, like these roots go down and kind of break up the soil and kind of help making nutrients available also for the lettuce. Intermixing flowers and vegetables. Why would it be a good idea to throw some flowers into your vegetable garden? Wait, I hear a lot of voices. Can't tell what. Wait, sorry. Keep bugs away. Oh, that's really fascinating. So I'm thinking attracting pollinators, but keep bugs away is interesting too, right? Because some flowers do keep certain bugs away, right? Yeah, interesting. And certainly the pollinators, yeah. So the more flowers that you have at any one time, the more and the greater diversity of pollinators you're going to get, and that can be helpful to your garden. Now also, if you want to install trellising or supports, this is a good time to do it. You can do it early before you plant anything else and just have it ready to go. So again, garden diversity, where you've got lots of different things, is smart gardening, and it kind of breaks things up and allows for a healthier ecosystem, if you will. There's also intensive gardening, going by various names, square foot gardening or intensive gardening. So again, if this is 4 feet wide, and this is just broken up into square foot grid. So each of these is 1 square foot. And you can access all of that, and instead of thinking about we have this row and then 3 feet between rows, instead of that, you just have it broken into this grid. And you can use string to mark the grid out if you want. I had those old blinds, like these big old blinds left over, and I just used the slats from that. Mark it however you want if you want to go this route. So, and there's a few copies up here of this sheet that gives some information here, but so basically within each square foot, there are some things where you can plant 16 of them within 1 square foot. There are other things where you can only plant 1. So on that sheet, it'll say that tomatoes need 18 to 24 inches, for example. You can do a tomato in 1 square foot if you prune your tomato. So I don't know, who knows what pruning tomatoes is? So you know what pruning tomatoes is. So what do you do when you prune a tomato? Since you volunteered. Do you want the microphone?
No, but it's kind of hard to explain, right? There's a leaf,
Mm-hmm.
and then you keep one main stem going, but you don't cut off the leaf, but in between the leaves, sometimes another vine will grow off of that. That's what I prune.
Mm-hmm. So the way it works, and it kind of depends, there's indeterminate and determinate tomatoes, so it kind of makes a difference too, but there's 2 ways of growing your tomato. You can just let it grow into a bush, just let it grow where it wants, or particularly with the indeterminate ones, you can keep it to 1 main stem like the trunk of a tree. And as he was saying, where you have a leaf going out and then your stem going up, you'll have this other little shoot that comes up right here and creates a whole new branch. So when it's small, just pop it out. It'll snap right out. If it doesn't snap right out, then you have water problems with your tomato, too little or too much, or it's too hot or whatever. But just snap those out, and that will keep it growing straight up, and all the energy of that plant will be going up. So what I like to do is put up a trellis and grow the tomatoes straight up the trellis. You can do it with any kind of tomato, yeah. Well, so again, determinate versus indeterminate will be the main thing. So an indeterminate tomato means it will keep growing, keep producing branches until frost kills it. A determinate tomato means that it will produce its crop, and then it will stop and not produce more. So with those indeterminates that will keep producing all season long, I like to grow them right up the trellis as opposed to having them branch out. And what it does, so it gets you off of the ground level. And when you've got fungal diseases coming in, these things, the fungi are in the soil, they're on the surface. If they're on a plant and then it rains, then they get spattered, onto the next plant. If you get it, the higher up you can get it, the further you get it away from a lot of these problems. So anyway, it's a neat thing to think about. Yeah.
The indeterminate versus determinate,
Mm-hmm.
tomatoes come in both?
Tomatoes do come in both. Yeah.
How do you know? How do you know?
It'll say on your seed packet. Now I don't know about from the seed library, but on your seed packet it'll tell you if it's an indeterminate or a determinate tomato variety. Or on the. Well, I guess if you're buying plants that have already been grown, then it's up to the garden center wherever you're getting it from yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, do you recommend starting seeds inside or having plants?
Okay, so the question is, do you recommend starting seeds inside or having plants? So cool season crops, these are things like lettuce and kale and cabbage. These things can be planted earlier, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Those we prefer to just plant outside. You don't have to, you can start them indoors. But those, it's fine to just plant outside because you can put them out there. Some of them can go out there as soon as you can work your garden. In general, we recommend that you wait until the soil temperature is 50 degrees. But the warm season ones, especially the ones that take a long time. So if you're doing like melons, for example, and it says it takes 90 days for you to harvest it. Well, if you wait until June 1st because of the crazy weather, right, and you plant them on June 1st, when are you going to harvest those, right? I mean, you're probably going to get hit with the frost in the fall before they're ready. Yeah, so the warm season ones like that, like tomatoes and peppers that are really slow growing, melons, these sorts of things, I would recommend starting indoors so that you have transplants that are ready to go. You don't want to start them, it's tricky. If you start them too early and they're really big when you put them out there, then that actually, the transplant shock tends to actually delay those so that ones that were smarter, or I'm sorry, smaller, maybe smarter too, will actually outgrow the ones that were bigger. Eventually they catch up. But so it's kind of a balancing act. And usually on the seed packets, it will tell you how much early, like it'll say sow seeds, 30 days before putting out in the garden or something like that.
Quick question.
Yeah.
You said you used like a trellis and did like one big sprout or one big trunk or whatever. Can you like curve that around, or is that just straight up?
No, you can weave it.
Okay.
As it's growing, you don't want to bend a really big part and break it, but they're flexible and you can move them around. And that's what I do. I've got, it's a trellis with like 8-inch square, and I weave the tomato up through it. Yeah. All right, so different things. So with this layout, you can do different things in different spacings. Here's a few examples. So the 3-inch spacing, this works well with things like beets, carrots, onions, radishes. And again, if you're doing 3-inch spacing, you can plant 16 in there. You can also do fewer in there and then throw some lettuce on top if you want to do something like that. 4-inch spacing, things like bush beans, spinach. 6-inch spacing, you get things that need a little more room, like Swiss chard, parsley, leaf lettuce. Now, leaf lettuce is a tricky one because you can also just pack that in if you want, and we sometimes do. And then just as they get too crowded, you just harvest them. Or because I like with leaf lettuce, as you get bigger leaves on the outside, I like to harvest those leaves and leave the smaller ones on the inside to grow, and that way you can keep harvesting from it for a long time. Yeah.
What's your opinion? I went to another gardening session and he said, your opinion on planting lettuce in gutters?
There's a picture of that in here.
Is there?
Yeah. Yep. All right. So again, you can do 12-inch, things like broccoli, cauliflower, peppers, tomatoes, melons. Again, tomatoes only if you prune. And melons, that's also using a trellising system because you got to, and I wonder if I have a picture in here. Well, somewhere I think I do, but anyway. So healthy soil is important as a good foundation. So a simple way to do a raised bed soil is just using half screened topsoil, please. So good quality screened topsoil. Now, there's no regulated definition of topsoil, so go to a place that has good products. Take a look at it, make sure it looks like it's decent stuff and it's not full of junk, and then have good quality compost. There's other things that you can do. People like to add like perlite or vermiculite, and they'll do 1/3 topsoil, 1/3 compost, 1/3 vermiculite or perlite. You can do that. The issue that I have with perlite and vermiculite is it's really dusty, and these are not dust that you really should be breathing in. So if you're mixing that, then wear a dust mask or something. It's also kind of pricey, but the reason that we add the perlite and the vermiculite is that it allows better drainage, better aeration, kind of loosens up the soil, and can also which one is it? The vermiculite? I think it's the vermiculite that will hold nutrients better. One of them holds nutrients well, and the other one doesn't. I mix them up, but.
I have a question about container. Should you let them rest for a season, or should you swap out soil, or can you just keep going year after year in a container garden?
Yeah, so do you have to let your container garden rest, or can you go year after year in it? So yeah, good point, good question. So part of it has to do with what you're planting. So if you rotate, and we're not getting into crop rotation on here, but if you're doing a crop rotation, then there are certain plants that benefit other plants. So if you do, If you do something that's a heavy feeder like corn and you follow it with something that's a nitrogen fixer, then you can just keep growing, keep rotating through. You can also keep using it if you just add fresh compost into it, or if you add fertilizer into it. And most people will add a little bit of fertilizer. So yeah, you can keep using it. Rotating is a good idea. Yeah.
By adding, when you say adding it in, are we pulling it in or just throwing it on top? What's happening?
Yeah. So, and that kind of comes back to the whole no-till, minimal till kind of thing, right? So compost, when you're adding it, it does help to kind of rake it into the top few inches. That will help kind of incorporate it in. You don't need to be going down 8 inches with it every year. You can also just top dress, where you just put a layer, depending on, I mean, there's quite a bit of nitrogen in these, really. So sometimes less is more. Sometimes you only need like a 1/4 inch of compost, 1/4 inch to an inch. You don't want to be putting on like 4 inches of compost every year. Yeah.
Silly question, let's just say I'm gonna plant in a few weeks. Can I spray the grass area, that like the weeds right now? Is that a bad thing to do?
So the question is about spraying to prepare. So a few comments. One of the most common things that people will do is spray Roundup. And for years, they were saying that it doesn't persist in the soil. It's like, this miracle thing that just kills everything and then goes away. I did work in Christmas trees, and we were seeing some kind of weird issues, and discovered that some of those might be Roundup related. So when you actually start looking at the soil chemistry, so Roundup breaks down into these secondary compounds, and then those will further break down, and you end up with some really kind of bad compounds that you don't want to have in your soil that can be causing problems. And this is, the occasional application is not going to be a big deal, but for people that are using it year after year, multiple times per year, especially like in commercial production, these really do build up in the soil. So if you want to do it once, that's not going to be a big deal. You want to be careful that you're like some plants are more sensitive. So, how much time you would need between, I'm not exactly sure. You'd want to read the label instructions, and it should tell you how long you have to wait before you could plant something there. But it's the things that we typically recommend would be that people, if you have a couple months, you're planning ahead, then lay like a plastic sheet over, like if you're doing a lawn area or whatever, just lay a plastic sheet over it and just let the sun cook it for 3 or 4 months, and it kills all that stuff. Yeah.
I've also used cardboard.
Yeah. Yep. You can do layers of cardboard, newspaper, thick mulch, any sorts of things to smother. And actually, something like cardboard is actually better than the plastic sheet, because the plastic sheet will actually kill microbes in the soil as well, and the cardboard will not, because it allows oxygen through. Yeah.
Can we talk about your recipe stuff again in your topsoil and compost?
Mm-hmm.
So I've been doing and thinking it's the right thing to do, maybe you can correct me. So at the end of the season, I take my raised beds, which my raised beds are tall like that. They're not 8 inches or 12 inches. They're tall. So I put on 4 or even 6 inches of leaves that are falling, the end of the grass clippings, things like that, and then leave it set.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the spring, what's still there, then I use my little hand hoe or whatever and kind of work it in, and then I plant. And then I don't add more fertilizer to the raised beds, but I'll add some mulch through grass clippings throughout the year. My question is doing it in the fall completely useless, counterproductive, is what I really want to know.
Mm-hmm.
Or is it just a good way to use up leaves?
All right. Yeah, so the question is, so in the fall, she puts leaves and grass clippings and stuff on the raised beds, and several inches of that, and just leaves it there. Is that a good idea or not? So yeah, it is a fine thing to do, and it will begin to break down over the winter, and it'll give you a nice amendment. And yes, it reduces the need for fertilizer in the raised beds. You might need to add fertilizer or more compost or something if you notice that you're just not getting the growth out of the plants that you were before. But that's a very good way of adding nutrients and building the structure of that soil.
A season ahead of time.
Yeah, doing it in the fall ahead of time it's good. It gives it time to break down. It's not fully composting it like you'd have in a big pile, but it is allowing nature to begin to break it down for incorporation. So yeah, it's a good process. Now the one thing that you will notice though, that layer on top is going to make the raised bed not heat up as soon in the spring. So like with you're essentially putting a mulch on it. So if people do a mulch over the winter, I always recommend that they rake it off in early spring so that soil can warm up, and then just put it back after it's warmed up. Otherwise, you can delay your planting time by a couple of weeks.
Okay, no, it's warmed up, is there like a temperature gauge or something in the soil?
Yeah, so, and I have a picture of it in here somewhere, but to check your soil temperature, use like just any kind of thermometer, like a kitchen thermometer. You only need to go in an inch or two, because we really don't care about, in terms of seed germination and initial planting, we really don't need to know what's going on 8 inches down. So if you're going down an inch or two, you want to do a reading in the morning, a reading in late afternoon if you can, and then average the two. So if it's 40 degrees in the morning and it's 60 degrees in late afternoon, then you get your average of 50, and you could go ahead and plant the cool season stuff. So I'm going to skip through vertical space here because we've got more things to go. There's the gutters, by the way. So somebody had mentioned growing lettuce and things like that in gutters. Because with shallow rooted things, you don't need a whole lot of space, and you can reuse a lot of things like old bed springs and pallets. There's a lot of things you can do with these. So when to plant outside? So for what we call the cool season plants, like leafy greens, onions, beets, peas, some of these can be planted as soon as you can work the soil in the spring. But kind of the rule of thumb is if it's 50 degrees in the way that we just described, then go ahead and plant. And then you want it over 60 degrees for other crops. Things like tomatoes will thank you if you wait till 70 degrees, but you don't always have the luxury. Yeah.
Is that 50 during the day, during the evening?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. So if you do a temperature like in the morning, and then do a temperature like late afternoon, and then take an average. So it's telling you that it's kind of the average over that 24-hour period. I mean, there's, yeah. Okay, so I want to take a quick break. We actually don't have much time on this. Maybe I'll come back to this. So I'll probably just put this back up at the end. But if you have a phone that will read QR codes or can type in the bit.ly thing if you've got data, we also have paper forms, but it's really helpful to have people fill out this basic demographic survey. So we get federal funding, and we have an easier time getting funding if we have good demographic data collected from presentations like this. So if you have a phone and you want to go ahead and grab the QR code or the bit.ly now and work on it, that's great. Otherwise, I'll just put it back up at the end since we only have a few minutes left. Give you guys a minute to snap that if you want. And like I said, it's just really helpful in terms of the funding. Yeah, that's good if you want to pass those out, and I'll just keep on talking while people fill them out. All right, we finally made it to planting the garden. So I'm hoping that your garden space looks a little nicer than this. You don't have quite so much clay. And when it comes to planting the garden, so like it's not that complicated. You take your seeds and you stick them in the ground using the same kinds of techniques that we used for indoor planting. So in terms of figuring out the depth and all of that, you can do a little slot if you want and do rows. I like to not do the rows. I like to use the more like the 1x1 grids or whatnot. And you just if you've got, it's just like with the potting up that we were talking about. If you've got transplants that you want to put out there, kind of work the roots a little bit. If they're, if you pull it out and it's not all root bound, then you don't have to do anything with it. You can just do a hole big enough for that to fit. And I'll do a hole that I can fit its pot in. And once the pot fits in it, then I tip the pot over, gently take the plant out and set it in that hole, and then just kind of press the soil in around it. And then when you've got everything in, just kind of water it in. So let me see. One thing I want to mention is hardening off. So if you have tomatoes or something that you've started indoors and you just take them and you set them outside, like put them right in the garden without acclimating them, there's a good chance that they're either going to be stunted or that they might straight up die. So we have a process of acclimation called hardening off, where for like, let's say a week or so before you're going to plant, you'll set the plant outside for a couple hours a day, first in kind of a sheltered location, and then maybe the next day give it an hour of sun or something like that. You want to get it used to being in a different climate than what it was grown in indoors. And eventually you want it to get it to the point where you can leave it outside all day and overnight and it's fine. And that's a good time to put it in the garden when it's ready to be outside and to live. The other thing that you can do to help with transplant shock is if you have like a cloudy day or a cooler day, that's a good day to put things in, because it's a little stressful to put these plants in the ground. You can put them in the middle of the hot sun as long as you water them in good, but it's going to be more stressful than if you have a cooler kind of cloudy day. Even a kind of a drizzly day is a really great day to be planting in the garden, and you don't have to water them. You can use things for like frost protection. Say you put your tomatoes in and then you discover that there's going to be this temperature at 28 degrees, you're going to lose your tomatoes. So if you're using those 4-foot raised beds, I just get the 1/2-inch PVC pipe, and if you stick one end like inside your raised bed, if you stick one end in the ground and then you bend the 10-foot piece over and stick the other end in 4 feet apart on the other side, it makes a hoop that goes across, and space those out 3 or 4 feet apart going down your garden, and you can throw bed sheets, whatever you can put on there to kind of add some extra protection, and you might be able to save some plants from frost. They do make frost blankets of different weights and different qualities, but really anything that you can do to just kind of offer protection to keep some heat in. You can also do like fill like milk jugs with water and put those next to the plants. If water freezes, it releases. When it freezes, it releases a lot of heat, and that can help warm, especially if it's covered. You can take milk jugs and cut the top off and then invert it and put it over the top of plants. If the plant's small enough and that offers protection, just make sure you take that off, because if you leave it in there and it gets up, really sunny the next day, you could cook your plant. So there's lots of different ways that you can try to protect things a little. So some smart watering tips. So if you're doing raised beds or containers, these will dry out faster than the ground. So you need to keep that in mind and water a little more often. Watering thoroughly and less frequently is also better. So you want to put in, so think of a 1/2 inch, if you can visualize a 1/2 inch of water over your garden root zone every 4 days, or like twice a week is good. You don't need to water it if it's raining regularly, but if it's not raining, and the hotter it gets or the more sandy your soil, you're going to have to bump it up. Also, watering at the base or in the morning is good. So a lot of these like fungal diseases and things will spread when they're wet. So trying to keep the foliage itself, the plant itself, dry and just water around the ground if you can is good. It also wastes less water. Another thing to think about is not having your plants too crowded together, because you want air to be able to circulate. And if they're crowded together and air can't circulate, you also can have problems with fungal diseases. So just throw that in there. So applying too much fertilizer does all kinds of horrible things. So this leaches through the ground and gets into our waterways. Too much phosphorus results in huge algae blooms in the Great Lakes. There's environmental problems that have been traced to home gardeners. So people like to put lots of chemicals on their lawn, lots of chemicals in their garden. A lot of that stuff, nitrogen, if it's not watered in, will volatilize and go up into the air, and you lose it that way. Or things like phosphorus will go down and leach into our water. So never apply more than the label rate. And if you can get away with less, then get away with less. Avoiding problems. So these are some of the things we talked about. So this is, I would quiz you on it, but we're kind of low on time. So this is blossom end rot. It's actually a calcium deficiency in tomato. But what it's caused by is uneven watering. So it's a lack of calcium, but the plant cannot take the calcium up because of the uneven watering. So tomatoes need consistent moisture. So if you're having a problem where you see like a sunken spot start on the bottom of your tomato and then turn black and spread, that's a sign that you probably need to be watering more frequently. with the tomatoes. So watch tomatoes in particular for that. This is Septoria leaf spot that I mentioned before. So having good aeration. If you see any kind of fungal disease showing up on your tomato, it usually starts on lower leaves. As soon as you see it, remove those leaves and then wash your hands before you touch any other part of the plant. Get those leaves out of there because it will spread fast, and you have a chance if you take those off. Once the plant's infected, fungicide sprays and stuff will not help either. So, but just having things spaced well where air can get through can be tricky with the intensive gardens, but you can kind of keep an eye on that. Keeping moisture, healthy moisture levels, and you can avoid a lot of problems. So container gardens, yeah, they're easy to move around. Yoda likes them and he approves. So one thing about containers, I like to sink them in the winter. So things that if the plants are hardy, like I'll do grapes in containers, for example, and the grapes would do fine outside, but the roots won't. So roots need a warmer temperature to survive. So I will just sink in my garden space, I just dig a hole and sink my pots for things like kiwi and grapes and raspberries and some other things that I like to have in containers sometimes. In India, they sink them in the ground for a couple other reasons, such as it gets really hot and sucks the water right out of their pots. So that picture's from India where they sink the pots in the ground also. You can use whatever you have. So you might find this interesting. So this just gives you an idea of what size pot you would need for different things if you're going to do container gardening. So think about it, the larger the plant, like a tomato, the bigger the pot that it needs. And if you want to do like a mix, if this is just kind of a fun little recipe, so if you want it, you can put in like onion sets in the bottom, and then put greens on top, and then you could have multiple things that you harvest out of that. A little bit on seed saving. So some seeds, like this is chives, we like to let, if they're in like a pod, let it dry down on the plant. If you have to harvest it, take the whole plant or like a stem and hang it upside down until it's dry, and then store the seeds. Otherwise, if you're dealing with, actually, oranges, you can take those seeds and grow them, and they're really fun to grow. But it starts with eating your food or doing something like that with it, accessing the seeds. If you let these things get really ripe and begin to rot, then you might get a more mature seed out of that. And a lot of times it's as simple as just saving the seeds. There's more about like controlling the pollination. There's wet processing and dry processing and all that. But especially with kids, it's fun to just save seeds and see what you can get. Obviously, the potato's different. You can cut that up, and every little eye will grow into a plant. But the main thing is just enjoy the journey. So, and here's valuable information that you can find at our website. You can Google gardening in Michigan or go to migarden.msu.edu. So I'm going to jump back and put that QR code on there again. And thank you very much. We're out of time. Otherwise, I would take more questions, but I appreciate you've been a very interactive group, and I've certainly enjoyed it.